The dust curled up from the road as Daniel Harper guided his weary horse toward the little whitewashed church on the rise. He sat tall in the saddle, but inside his chest there was no pride, only the ache of a man who had wrestled too long with poverty and was finally giving in to a bargain that tasted of desperation. His boots were worn through at the heels, the brim of his hat bent from sun and sweat, and his eyes hollowed out by too many nights lying awake, listening to the silence of an empty ranch. He had grown up believing land made a man strong, that cattle were the backbone of a future, and that hard work would keep everything steady. But drought and debt collectors cared little for hard work. He was a man staring at the bones of his father's dream, and there was no miracle left, except the woman stepping down from a carriage in front of the church, her dress straining against her body, her chin tilted downward as whispers rose around her. Clara Belle's carriage wheels had barely stopped before she reached for the doorframe to steady herself. She moved carefully, the pale blue dress her aunt had sewn clinging at the waist and bunching around her hips. She knew what people saw first. They always did. She carried her weight like a brand on her skin, one she could never escape. As she stepped onto the ground, the chatter of the townsfolk sharpened like knives. She did not need to hear the words to know what they said, too big, too plain, too quiet. A woman men overlooked until they realized the size of the inheritance she carried. Clara Belle held her flowers tighter, willing her hands not to shake, willing herself to keep breathing. She was not marrying for love, she had stopped believing in such things long ago. She was marrying for a chance at belonging, a chance to be useful to someone. Daniel dismounted stiffly, tying his horse to the post before striding toward her. He told himself not to look at her as a woman, but as a means to an end. Still, when he lifted his eyes, he caught something unexpected in hers, a loneliness as deep as his own, something that made his chest tighten against his will. He nodded once, curt and polite, then offered his arm. She hesitated before taking it, her hand soft against the roughness of his sleeve. Together, they walked into the church, every pair of eyes tracking them like they were a show put on for entertainment. The preacher's voice was steady, but the words felt heavy to Daniel, each one a reminder that he was sealing himself into a contract he had not wanted, though he needed it more than air. His throat was dry as he spoke his vows, the words, "I do," landing like stones in his gut. Clara Belle's vow came out faint, almost a whisper, like she feared her voice might break apart if she dared say it too strong. When the preacher declared them man and wife, polite applause filled the room, but underneath it was a tide of whispers. He only married her for the ranch, poor soul, tied to her now, maybe he'll make the best of it. Clara Belle lowered her gaze, cheeks burning, flowers trembling in her hands. Daniel set his jaw, pretending not to hear, but the whispers clung to him like burrs on wool. He told himself it did not matter. He had cattle again, land worth saving, and a chance to keep the Harper name alive. That was what counted. The ride home was quiet. The sky stretched wide, the prairie gold in the setting sun, but neither of them could find words to cut through the silence. Clara Belle sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her lips pressed thin. Daniel glanced at her once or twice, wondering what went on behind her still expression. Did she feel the same shame he did, or was she simply resigned? He wanted to ask, but pride closed his throat, so he kept his silence. The Harper Ranch came into view, fences in need of repair, a roof patched more than once, pastures worn thin. Clara Belle's heart tightened as she took it in. This was not the home she had imagined as a girl, dreaming of weddings and laughter. But when she looked closer, she saw something else, the bones of a place that had once thrived, a house built with care even if it had weathered too many storms. She could feel the ghost of love in its walls, and she wondered if, perhaps, she might bring life back to it. Daniel carried her trunk inside, setting it down in the corner before retreating to the kitchen to pour himself water. He expected silence, perhaps awkward small talk, but instead Clara Belle moved about the house with quiet purpose. She tied on an apron, rolled up her sleeves, and began cooking as though she had always belonged there. Soon the air filled with the smell of fresh bread rising, rich stew simmering, and butter melting over warm rolls. Daniel sat at the table, stunned. He could not remember the last time the house had carried the scent of comfort. He had lived on jerky and stale biscuits for months, too tired to cook, too stubborn to ask for help. He ate that night until he was full for the first time in memory, though he could not bring himself to thank her. Something about gratitude felt too dangerous. Gratitude could slip into attachment, and attachment was not part of the bargain. He reminded himself this was business, nothing more. She was his wife only in name, her worth measured by the cattle and the land she had brought. He would not let himself forget it. But later, when the lantern burned low and the ranch house grew quiet, Daniel found himself listening. From the kitchen came a soft sound, Clara Belle's voice, humming a tune as she cleaned dishes. The melody was gentle, carrying with it a sorrowful sweetness that pressed against him in a way he could not shake. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, fists clenched, telling himself it was nothing, that it meant nothing. Yet he listened all the same, the sound winding into his chest, leaving behind a weight he did not know how to name. Clara Belle lay awake too, her heart aching with the knowledge of what people said, what Daniel must think. She knew he had not wanted her, not really. But as she closed her eyes, she whispered a prayer, not for love, not even for happiness, but simply for a chance to prove she was worth more than the whisper said. She would work until her hands bled if she had to. She would make the Harper Ranch breathe again. And maybe, just maybe, she would find a place for herself in the life of the man she had married. The days rolled into weeks, and weeks into months, and Clara Belle proved herself over and over again in ways Daniel had not expected. She was not a woman who shirked work. Before dawn she rose, her heavy frame moving slow at first, but with a determination that refused to bend. Daniel would step out of the barn to find her already in the garden, pulling weeds with her skirts tied up around her waist, dirt smudging her cheeks, sweat dampening the strands of hair that had fallen loose from her braid. Chickens clucked around her, and the smell of fresh earth and early blossoms carried through the morning air. He remembered the whispers, how people had laughed, claiming she'd be too soft, too fragile for ranch life. But day by day, she was proving them wrong. Daniel watched her quietly at first, unwilling to admit even to himself how much of the ranch's revival was due to her hands. His pride bristled at the thought, but he could not deny the changes around him. The cattle grew fatter, feeding on her land where the grass still grew. The vegetables in the garden she planted filled their table with food he had not tasted in years: sweet corn, beans, squash. The pantry, once bare, slowly lined itself with jars she canned by hand. The house, which had been hollow and silent, carried warmth again. She dusted the shelves, patched curtains, mended sheets, and though the walls were still weathered, the place began to feel alive. Yet despite the work, the whispers in town did not die. Clara Belle heard them when they went to buy supplies, when she stood behind Daniel at the mercantile. Poor rancher, saddled with her. He must have been desperate. All that woman has to offer is her father's cattle. Some spoke low, others not at all, but Clara Belle knew. She lowered her gaze, gripped her basket tighter, and followed Daniel back out without a word. She never spoke of it, but the sting lived in her chest long after. One evening, Daniel came home later than usual, his body aching from a day of branding calves. The sun had set, and the last light stretched across the prairie in shades of fire and gold. He found Clara Belle sitting on the porch, the chair creaking beneath her as she leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap. He was about to pass her by, to head straight into the house, when he saw the shine of tears slipping down her cheeks. She did not sob. She cried quietly, as if she had learned long ago to hide sorrow from the world. Daniel stopped, unsure. "What's wrong?" The words came rough, surprising him with the concern in them. She shook her head, wiping quickly at her cheeks. "It's nothing. It don't look like nothing." Her hands trembled against her lap as she finally whispered, "I know why you married me." The air thickened between them. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Clara Belle turned her gaze to the horizon, her voice steady now, though soft. "I hear them all. I see the way they look at me, the way they look at us. I don't blame you, Daniel. Not for one second. You had no choice. A man does what he must to save what he loves. And she paused, swallowing hard, "I wasn't expecting anything more." Her honesty cut deeper than he could bear. Daniel had never been a man of many words, but her quiet courage shook something loose inside him. He wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, that he hadn't just married her for cattle and land. But the truth burned too close, and he could not force lies into the air between them. He stayed silent, his pride locking his tongue. Clara Belle looked down at her hands, twisting them together. "I may not be the woman anyone dreams of. I know that, but I know how to love. I know how to stand beside a man if he'll let me. Not as a bargain, not as a burden. As a wife." The word stunned him. For weeks he had seen her as someone carrying shame, someone enduring her place in his life quietly. He had not expected the fire, the strength that poured out of her now. She was not begging, not pleading. She was offering herself with dignity, asking only for the chance to be more than what others called her. That night, Daniel lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while her words echoed through him. He thought of how she had come to his ranch and breathed life into it again, how she worked herself raw without complaint, how she bore the stares of others with her head held higher than he had given her credit for. And he realized, though he did not want to admit it, that she had given him more than he had ever given her. She had restored his ranch, filled his table, steadied his days, and softened the silence of his nights. She had been giving him love all along, though he had been too blind, too proud to see it. When the first light of dawn stretched across the land, Daniel rose from bed with his chest tight, a restlessness in his bones. He found her outside, already in the garden with dirt under her nails, pulling weeds from between the rows of beans. She looked up, startled, as he knelt beside her. He was not a man used to lowering himself before anyone, but this time his pride bent easily. He placed his calloused hand over hers, rough skin against soft. Her eyes widened, questions trembling in their depths. He cleared his throat, words slow and halting but true. "Clara Belle, I was a fool. I thought I was just marrying land, marrying cattle. But I see now, I was blind. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. The kindest, and if you'll have me, not as a man desperate to save his ranch, but as a man who finally sees you, I want to love you properly." The morning breeze caught the loose strands of her hair as her lips parted, trembling. Tears welled in her eyes again, but they were not the tears of sorrow he had seen the night before. They were bright, shining with something new. She lifted her hand, touched his cheek gently, and whispered, "Then you've already given me more than I ever dreamed, Daniel Harper." The ranch around them stretched white and golden, the sun casting its light across the fields. For the first time, Daniel felt the weight in his chest ease. This woman he had married out of desperation was not his burden. She was his miracle, and though he could not change the whispers in town, he no longer cared. The ranch was alive again, not only in the fields and the cattle, but in his heart. And the woman who had come as a stranger was now the one thing he could not imagine living without.